evening, dear Medyascope viewers. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. This evening, our guest will be Dimitar Bechev, joining us to speak about Turkey-Russia relations. But first, let's take a look at the developments of the week. We begin our bulletin with the coronavirus-related developments of the week. According to the data released by the Ministry of Health, the daily number of new cases on February 25 has been announced as 9,572, and the number of deaths as 73. These numbers have led to the total number of cases to reach 2,674,766 and the death toll to become 28,358.
Turkey has started the vaccination of teachers ahead of the commencement of face-to-face education slated for the 1st of March. Education Minister Ziya Selçuk received his first shot in the central Anatolian province of Çorum on February 24. According to the statement of the minister, the Ministry of Health did the necessary planning with regards to the procurement of vaccines for teachers. We sent the list of our 1,259,000 school employees to the ministry, Selçuk said. Our schools are ready, he said, adding that almost all schools have obtained the My School is Clean document, showing that the related school has completed all necessary preparations amid the pandemic. Turkey will gradually start face-to-face education for primary school students as well as for the students in 8th and 12th grades on the 1st of March, in line with the country's gradual reopening process. The vaccination program was launched on January 14, and more than 7.5 million doses of the Chinese Sinovac vaccine have been administered to people so far. Health Minister Fahrettin Koca on February 25 stated that a deal was made to procure 100 million dosages of the Sinovac vaccine by May at the latest. This way, we will be able to vaccinate 52.5 million of our citizens, Koca said. Harsh criticism was directed towards Koca this week when he attended the crowded funeral of Islamic scholar Muhammed Emin Saraç. The criticism came especially from citizens who had to organize funerals for their loved ones with a limited number of people, as the minister urged them to have 30 people at most in such ceremonies. Koca apologized for attending the funeral, stating, "At that funeral, I could not foresee that there would be a picture where distance would disappear. Should I have foreseen it? Yes, I should have. It is my fault. I apologize to our citizens for this." Moreover, further controversy arose in relation to the Justice and Development Party organizing provincial congresses, where crowds are seen having completely disregarded social distancing. Widespread criticism by medical experts, politicians, and the wider public have been directed at the AKP, as several restrictions are currently still in place for restaurants, cafes, unions, and associations. The opposition says that the AKP is using the pandemic as an excuse to ban demonstrations and protests, but flocking the measures when it comes to serving its own agenda. The AKP, on the other hand, claims that it pays attention to the virus measures, that there is limited participation in the congresses, and images of crowds stem from citizens' love for President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan.
Controversy surrounding the AKP has been multiple this week. AKP Parliamentary Group Deputy Chairwoman Özlem Zengin's statements in relation to strip searches and pregnancies in Turkish prisons caused widespread criticisms as hundreds of women shared the traumatic experiences they have been subjected to.
AKP Parliamentary Group Deputy Chairwoman Özlem Zengin dismissed allegations and criticisms about strip searches in Turkey's prisons, stating that the survivors wouldn't have waited as long as they did to report the incidents. An honorable and moral woman would not wait for a year to announce it. This is a fictional narrative, Zengin stated. Her response comes after People's Democratic Party deputy and human rights activist Ömer Faruk Gergerlioğlu had exposed that strip searches have become systematic in Turkish prisons. In reaction to Zengin's words, hundreds of women recounted the traumatic experiences they were subjected to in prisons across Turkey, including world-renowned Turkish folk singer Selda Bağcan. Zengin this week responded to criticism on babies growing up in prisons, claiming that women get pregnant upon orders from various illegal organizations. These people are having babies upon orders so that they can say there are pregnant women or women with babies in prisons, Zengin said on February 21. According to Zengin, the aim of those revealing the human rights abuses that women suffer in prisons is to harm faith, our values, and headscarves. Meanwhile, a lawyer by the name of Mert Yaşar has been arrested on February 23 for insulting Zengin on Twitter.
President Erdogan has come to the defense of his son-in-law and former finance minister Berat Albayrak after main opposition said Albayrak's policies cost Turkey billions of dollars in central bank reserves.
In a speech he gave to a provincial congress of his ruling Justice and Development Party on February 22, President Erdogan defended his son-in-law and former finance minister Berat Albayrak over last year's steep drop in FX reserves, saying Bayrak's biggest misfortune was that the title of son-in-law overshadowed his accumulation of knowledge, efforts, and success. Erdogan's address comes in response to main opposition Republican People's Party's accusations against Albayrak. The CHP has blamed Albayrak for economic woes and demanded to know what had happened to the FX funds that it said was sold from the central bank's reserves. A lawyer for Albayrak said CHP's campaign comprised ugly slander and attempts at smearing the former minister, adding that they would file a 500,000 lira damages lawsuit over the campaign. In November, Albayrak abruptly resigned shortly after Erdogan replaced the central bank governor. In his 2-year term as finance minister, the lira slumped to record lows, while foreign exchange reserves dwindled under a policy of state banks selling an estimated $130 billion to support the lira. Current Finance Minister Lütfi Elvan had earlier defended Albayrak's reserves policy as a response to the extraordinary demands of the COVID-19 pandemic. Since Albayrak stepped down, the lira has rallied more than 20%, and foreign investors have snapped up Turkish assets on expectations of more orthodox policies. However, after Erdogan's speech defending Albayrak, the lira tumbled again, losing nearly half the year's gains this week alone. Meanwhile, rumors have been circulating that Albayrak may return to the political scene. According to Reuters, an official from Erdogan's AK Party said that Albayrak's possible reappointment as a cabinet minister had recently been discussed internally, and that a final decision could be made at a party convention in coming weeks. Some are sure that he will be appointed energy minister, but Erdogan will decide. There are also those in the party that say this is not possible, the official told Reuters.
President Erdogan this week also spoke in relation to the Kanal Istanbul project. He said on February 24th that the works for the project will start soon, regardless of the opposition. Erdogan said, "We will build it despite them. They will get used to it." Istanbul Metropolitan Municipal Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu responded to Erdogan saying, "For those who see obstinance as a skill, let me remind you of June 23. Istanbul is greater than one," referencing the rerun municipal elections that took place on June 23 after the AKP canceled the March 31 results. In both cases, Ekrem İmamoğlu won and became municipal mayor of the city. İmamoğlu further added that this was a ploy to change the agenda and that he would not be party to it. On February 21, the People's Democratic Party MP Ömer Faruk Gergerlioğlu's prison sentence given in 2018 was upheld by the 16th Penal Chamber of the Court of Cassation. The court ruling against Gergerlioğlu drew widespread criticism on social media.
HDP MP Ömer Faruk Gergerlioğlu was sentenced to 2 years and 6 months in prison by the Kocaeli Second Heavy Penal Court in 2018. On February 21, the 16th Penal Chamber of the Court of Cassation upheld the decision. Gergerlioğlu was on pre-trial release and had requested his acquittal. The court found Gergerlioğlu guilty of engaging in propaganda, glorifying and promoting the violent and coercive methods of the PKK. Thus, he was sentenced to 2 years and 6 months in prison for engaging in terrorist organization propaganda. After the ruling, Gergerlioğlu announced that he will apply to the Constitutional Court to appeal against the verdict. Addressing the public at the parliament, Gergerlioğlu said that the Court of Cassation ruling was a politically motivated decision. In accordance, the Right and Justice platform released a written statement about Gergerlioğlu where they gave support and solidarity. The platform statement read that, "In this country, the basic units of the state have always been mobilized to criminalize rights advocacy and silence the ones defending rights. This attitude stems from the government's fear of being unable to protect the authority that it built itself with an unlawful and unjust method. For this reason, it sees everyone who says something against its unlawful and unjust authority as a dangerous person. Having devoted his life to human rights struggles, dealt with unjust treatment of everyone regardless of their views, and made efforts to eliminate human rights violations in Turkey, Gergerlioğlu is regarded as a dangerous politician for the government." In addition to the support given by the Right and Justice platform, MP Gergerlioğlu received wide support across the country through social media. Speaking to Medyascope on February 24, Gergerlioğlu said the following: I receive support from all backgrounds, perspectives, beliefs, observances, and political views. Of course, this is very flattering for me. I have ideals. My goal has been to raise the Turkish standards for human rights and democracy. Along with that, for Turkey to come to a better place in the world. I have always believed that we can reduce the country's problems to a minimum, that we can establish a shared living space, and that we can build a democratic state of law, even though there can be some hardships along the way. Gergerlioğlu's arrest comes in the midst of a political debate regarding the removal of parliamentary immunities. Recently, there were 33 summaries of proceedings proposed to the Turkish parliament that call to remove the immunities of 33 MPs, of which 25 are from HDP. President Erdogan has been calling for the prosecution of the HDP members of the parliament, accusing them of acting as a political wing of the PKK, a terrorist organization recognized by Turkey, the United States, and the European Union.
International support for Boğaziçi University is growing as the government continues to target Boğaziçi-affiliated individuals. Here are the developments of the week.
As part of the Boğaziçi protests going on for nearly 2 months against the government-appointed rector Melih Bulu, students and academics have been offering open courses at Boğaziçi University. This week, more iconic academics voiced their support to Boğaziçi student protesters. On February 24, Judith Butler, an American philosopher, gender theorist, and academic, along with Şebnem Korur Fincancı, the Turkish Medical Association Central Council Chair, gave online courses to Boğaziçi students. Judith Butler, who is currently a Maxine Elliott Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Program of Critical Theory at the University of California, Berkeley, gave an open course on transregional solidarities. Butler's works emphasize on the theory of gender performativity and often challenge the conventional notions of gender roles. Judith Butler commented the following on the topic of academic freedom to Boğaziçi students.
But when a rector or an administrator is illegitimately put in place, then that promise of academic freedom is destroyed. In other words, not only is that person illegitimate, not brought in through the usual means, which depend on established faculty governance procedures at Boğaziçi, but also representing an illegitimate incursion on your freedom in his person, right? And he cannot be the person who stops illegitimate incursions on your academic freedom, which is the task of the administrator, one of the key tasks of the administrator within the doctrine of academic freedom as it is accepted internationally. So, you know, that is one of the main problems, of course, which you know better than I do. But I want to suggest that academic freedom can be secured only if administrations, which include rectors, are prepared to stand up to state actors, including elected and appointed governmental officials who seek to close down programs that are perceived as a threat to society or seek to make appointments within the university bypassing shared governance procedures. So anyone appointed to the post of rector has to accept that they cannot intervene in academic inquiry.
On the same day, Şebnem Korur Fincancı also gave an online course where she talked about academia and human rights in Turkey.
Unfortunately, the politicians who accuse us of getting political are in fact mixing politics with science. By directing the public in accordance with their point of view, they are taking away academic freedoms.
As part of the international support for Boğaziçi protests, International Students Union Magna Carta Universitarum released a statement in support of Boğaziçi University's autonomy. The letter by Magna Carta Universitarum stated that this violates the established rules and practices of university governance and infringes upon the autonomy of the university. Furthermore, Professor Bulu's involvement in the AKP is seen as evidence of a possible political motive for his appointment. Meanwhile, the Turkish government continues to attack the Boğaziçi community for supporting the resistance against government-appointed rector Bulu. On February 20, the Interior Minister Süleyman Soylu targeted the former Boğaziçi rector Professor Üstün Ergüder in relation to his support for the resistance against President Erdogan's rector appointment. The outdoor area where the academics staged their protests was named after Ergüder, who was the first elected rector after the military coup of 1980. In reaction to Soylu's attack on Professor Üstün Ergüder, a group of former university rectors and Council of Higher Education members released a joint statement of solidarity. The statement read that, "We are against all types of actions aimed at eliminating university autonomy and academic freedoms. We support our dear friend Professor Üstün Ergüder's statement in this context." On February 23, MHP Chair Devlet Bahçeli called on the protesters again. However, this time, he completely flipped his approach and asked the students to voice their concerns so they could resolve it. In the previous weeks, Bahçeli has called the students terrorists, barbarians, vandals, and snakes. Boğaziçi University students responded to Bahçeli's new call by urging him to first stop using the word terrorist when referring to them.
This evening, our guest is Dimitar Bechev, joining us to speak about Turkey-Russia relations. Mr. Bechev is a fellow at the Atlantic Council Europe Center and the Institute for Human Sciences, Vienna, as well as a visiting researcher at Oxford University. Dr. Bechev has written extensively on EU's external relations, the politics and modern history of Turkey, and the Balkans and Russia's foreign policy. Hello, Mr. Bechev. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, it's great to be with you.
So for the past few weeks on This Week in Turkey, we've been speaking extensively about the future of Turkey-US relations under the new Biden administration. So this week, we'd like to look at Turkey's relation with another superpower, Russia. And we'll talk about the specifics of the S-400s and the Syrian civil war in a bit. But in terms of a general outline, how would you describe the main kind of characteristics and the main goals of Russia and of Turkey, and how has their relationship, the relationship between the two countries evolved over the past few years in line with these goals?
Well, it's complicated. That's how I describe this relationship. It's not just a Facebook status, but I think it applies to the complex nature of Russian-Turkish dealings. On the one hand, Turkey and Russia are adversaries. They compete on a lot of issues, and Syria would be a prime example, but it's not the only one. We've seen also how it has played out in Libya lately. But on the other hand, they have learned how to live side by side, but also over the past 5 years or so to cooperate on security matters. And that's the role of Putin and Erdogan personally, to bring this relationship to a level that we didn't expect and we certainly didn't witness earlier over the past couple of decades since Russia emerged from the ex-Soviet Union. Now, what is Russia's game? What Russia wants from Turkey? Well, first of all, Turkey is a key NATO member. And as long as it pursues its own policy and goes it alone, picking fights with the United States, that's a strategic gain for the Russians. Secondly, Russia has intervened in Syria, changed the rules of engagement there, and obviously saved the Assad regime. But it does need a Turkish cooperation to very much provide end to the conflict and also stabilize its gains and ultimately probably exit Syria. So their interests partly coincide also in those regional conflicts. The same goes probably for Libya, even if the game might be different there. Russia and Turkey on the opposite sides. But if there is an end game in the conflict, it goes through some sort of arrangement whereby Turkey and Russia are guarantors. So we see how they fight, but also they have reasons to join forces and work towards common purposes. And lastly, there's the ideological or ideational dimension. Turkey has, especially since the abortive coup attempt in 2016, has turned really in domestic rhetoric, but also in politics against the West, especially the United States. And that has put it on the same wavelength with the Putin regime. Remember that Russia earlier in Putin's presidency was similarly entertaining ideas of being partnered with the West. There have been many resets, during 9/11, but also afterwards. After Putin came back to power in 2012, the main headline was Russia as a competitor, as a rival of the West. Anti-Westernism became a key motto of the regime that puts Turkey and Russia on the same wavelength. But again, we shouldn't forget the competitive nature that often comes to the fore, and we've seen a few instances over the past year.
Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, both in the Syrian civil war, and you mentioned also Libya, there have been several times where Turkey and Russia have come face to face, yet there's also a very delicate balance there. How do you foresee the balance, especially in Idlib, moving forward? Is there the potential for new clashes here, especially when we consider the dynamic between Moscow and Damascus?
Well, the Turkish policy in Idlib before the crisis was to look at Russia as a restraining factor on the regime. As long as Russia guaranteed the deals made over Idlib in 2018 and onwards, the Assad forces wouldn't attempt to seize the region. What happened was just the exact opposite. There was a big offensive that started in 2019. Russia, instead of restraining Assad, went along and dispatched its air force, which actually forced Turkey to fight back and stand its ground in the hope of bringing the Russians back to the table and stabilizing the front. Ultimately, that was more or less the outcome. Russia kind of calibrated its response. Of course, it probably used its air force to attack Turkish forces. We don't know about this incident, a year ago, but likely it was the Russian Air Force involved in the death of 34 Turkish servicemen. But on the other hand, as the Assad forces overrun Turkish observation points, it was the Russians guaranteeing their security. And ultimately, in March, Putin and Erdogan set together and pieced together this plan where each of them had something to bring back, some gains to make. How sustainable it is, we don't know, because the regime is a black box, and also it's dealing with the Russians as well as the Iranians are very opaque. But many people predicted that the situation was volatile because of so many spoilers, including Idlib itself, with HTS not being fully beholden to Turkey and being there to support it. But as far as I see the dynamics on the ground, it seems that the deal has stuck. We've seen now, of course, again, the HTS leadership trying to rebrand itself as a political force and reach out to the Americans, which probably gives an excuse to Turkey to slow down on this or respond to the Russian arguments that it's not doing enough to disarm radical elements and to integrate it into its own forces. But long story short, I'm a bit more upbeat about the fate of Idlib right now. Probably ultimately what will happen there, and of course I might be completely wrong here, is that Idlib will turn into yet another buffer zone policed by Turkey, a bit like what you have in northern Aleppo and Afrin, and also east of the Euphrates. And that's the ultimate fate of Idlib as a Turkish protectorate of sorts.
Mm-hmm. Another key issue and another kind of ongoing problem that we've been speaking about quite a bit in the past few weeks has been the crisis Turkey's purchase of the S-400 missile system has caused in its relationship with the United States. Now, we've witnessed Turkey's changing rhetoric in relation to the S-400s. While its purchase was justified as a necessity for national security, now there is talk of possible scenarios where these arms will not be activated. And on top of that, it was reported that Turkey has hired a lobbying firm in the US in order to remain in the F-35 fighter jet program. But there are also reports that Turkey is meeting with Russia in order to procure a second batch of the S-400s. How do you expect this to play out, and what impact will it have on Turkey's relations with Russia?
Well, I think Russians want the second delivery to take place. And probably they don't have a preference whether Turkey uses or not, because the damage, I mean, they'll get their money, even if it's underwritten by a Russian loan, the deal itself. And the political damage on the Atlantic Alliance is done. So either way, Russia wins this one. The big question is how the Biden administration will sort it out with the Turks. As long as Trump was in office, Ankara had an ally, and he was doing his best to prevent sanctions under the 2017 legislation on countering America's adversaries through sanctions. But even at the end of the Trump administration, there were some sanctions. Now, I think what Turks want is to find some compromise by applying salami tactics that will get to keep the missiles in order not to displease the Russians, but at the same time do some concessions, make some concessions to Washington. And the fine tuning of this deal is still undecided, because we don't really know how Biden administration will draw the red lines. So what is acceptable to them? It seems to me that Erdogan thinks that there is a compromise to be had, that he can probably have the cake and eat it. How hard Biden will push remains to be seen. But I think the instinct of the administration is to not to lose Turkey, because ultimately they are committed to boosting NATO. Turkey is an essential player in NATO, and even if it cooperates with Russia, its interests are not fully identical with those of the Russians. But that's again a theory, that there is a compromise, and we'll find out whether it's feasible or not, whether Washington could kind of swallow it. I think if there's a second shipment, that's probably will kill any attempt to reach compromise, and we'll be again in this unclear territory. And you're very right to point out F-35, because right now that's the most serious punishment Washington has imposed on Turkey. And the sanctions on the cuts have been very limited. They've kind of targeted officials in the military procurement agency, but haven't gone quite into Erdogan's narrow circle. It's very much the same with the European sanctions, by the way. So it seems to me that America is not ramping up pressure, at least not yet, and leaves some room for compromise and negotiations.
I mean, you mentioned NATO. I mean, Turkey has been kind of positioned as, you know, the ally which is causing problems because of the S-400 purchase, but also in relation to the conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean, where, you know, NATO aligns itself more so with Greece, and Turkey is the problem maker. Recently, Gönül Tol actually penned an article where she writes that Turkey can, you know, is developing a strategy to counter Russian influence in the Black Sea, and how this could be beneficial also for NATO. Turkey is taking steps on the foreign policy front, stepping up its cooperation with the Ukraine and Georgia and Azerbaijan, and Gönül Tol states that these countries are instrumental in its efforts to balance the Russian military presence in the Black Sea and the South Caucasus. So can Turkey play a larger coordinating role in that sense, which would potentially improve its relations with NATO and create a more established presence for NATO in this strategic region of the Black Sea?
Well, I think she is right. Turkey is balancing against Russia, and NATO is very useful because it's a multilateral organization, and whatever it does against the Russians is not a Turkish decision. So Turkey can hide behind the alliance and go along with it without being put on the spot by Russia. Secondly, Gyonu is right that all those bilateral relations with Ukraine, but also with Georgia and Azerbaijan are instrumental towards balancing Russian influence. But it's not something new. It's been going on for a long time under the radar. The high-level cooperation council between Ukraine and Turkey has been in operation for a decade. Discussions about defense industry cooperation have gone on for a long time. For instance, the Turkish naval program Milgem has attracted interest. Even the previous Ukrainian President Poroshenko and his team expressed interest. But up to now, that's only talk. I haven't seen anything concrete emerging. The fact of the matter is, if you look at the military balance, is that Turkey is outgunned in the Black Sea. Until Crimea, there was a case to be made that the Black Sea was a condominium with two major powers, Turkey and Russia. After the seizure of the peninsula and its militarization, Russia is the dominant power. And I think Erdogan was very frank during this short period when, during the jet crisis in 2016, when he told the NATO Secretary General that Black Sea is a Russian lake. So whatever Turkey does, it's playing catch up. There's some certain limits, but that doesn't mean that it's not active, and there's something to be done. But again, the big issue is not between Russia and Turkey in the Black Sea, it's between NATO, United States, and the Russians. And Turkey will try to position itself, but ultimately probably engage in soft balancing. That is pushing against Russia, but not very hard in order to jeopardize. And that's for many Turkish policymakers, it seems the fear. And that's nothing new. That was the case also during the Georgian War in 28, is that if push comes to shove, NATO won't be there and the US won't be there. It will be Turkey facing alone the Russians. And that's not a situation you entertain, because as we've seen in Syria, the Russians have a lot of instruments and tools of pressure that can inflict damage on Turkey. And so it's a very fine line between balancing, but as well not overplaying your hand in order to provoke the Russians.
Mm-hmm. Another issue that's come up since Biden took office is the role of democracy, democratic values, and he has been highlighting this quite a bit. And since Turkey has been also sending messages that it wants to improve its relationship with the West, so Erdogan announced that a new reform package was going to be presented and so forth. However, despite these words, when we look at the recent developments in Turkey, we can see that that's just it, that these are just words, because the systematic pressure against the HDP is ongoing. The reaction facing the Boğaziçi protest, the anti-LGBTQI rhetoric, and so forth. So it doesn't really seem that Erdogan has any intentions of upholding the state of law or protecting democratic values anytime soon. So could the unwillingness to make a change in this regard affect Turkey's alliances and perhaps push it towards Russia, since Moscow won't bother really Turkey on such matters? I mean, what role does democracy and the state of law and human rights and so forth play in these relations?
Well, it will make a rapprochement more difficult, for sure. Although we have to be careful and not to overstate, especially for the US, the importance of domestic politics and Turkish internal conditions. At the end of the day, historically, strategic arguments have weighed more on Turkish-US relations, one way or the other, than the state of democracy in the country. And even if, of course, Biden wants to put human rights, rule of law, democracy at the center of American foreign policy, harsh realities of power politics in the Black Sea, but also in the Middle East, will dictate otherwise with Turkey, and Erdogan knows it. I think this type of agenda is probably much more pertinent to the relationship between the EU and Turkey. It plays a larger role. And the most obvious example is the discussion around the update of the customs union, which is a big prize. I mean, there's a lot of benefits entailed if Turkey is to upgrade its commercial relations with the EU. But it's not politically feasible right now unless Turkey does something of substance on domestic front, and that's been made very clear by Angela Merkel and as well as others. And remember, this is Germany, which actually is right now probably the loudest voice for engagement in the European Council. We're not talking about the Turkish skeptics, France and onwards. So as long as there is no progress on this front in Turkey, it's very difficult to envisage any upgrade of the relationship with the EU. Again, I think with the US, it's different. The kind of political, strategic security relationship dimension will prevail in shaping. And I don't think that Turkey will necessarily jump into Russia's embrace. Its policy is one of focusing on Turkish strategic autonomy, as it were, and it will continue to balance between the West, Russia, but also China, in pursuit of what Erdogan and his circle consider national interests. And of course, that's very often synonymous with his personal or party interests as well. They become difficult to disentangle at this stage.
Yeah, and on that note, just to kind of take a step back, many do state that Turkey's kind of foreign policy has a lot to do with what's going on internally. Ankara pursues foreign relations designed to protect and strengthen Erdogan's political standing at home, and so that he politically is able to survive at home. Would you agree? How do you see Erdogan's current popularity at home?
Oh yeah, absolutely, and that's nothing new again. I think it's generic, it's not something limited to Turkey. It's a generic feature of any populist movement or leader. You use foreign policy as a domestic mobilization tool. If you go back in time, the Mavi Marmara crisis, you see how this mechanism or this phenomenon played out. Later on, we had the coup attempt where it came to the fore. So whenever you're tempted, whenever you have challenges at home, you might use the external threat in order to rally society behind the flag. There are limits to this strategy, because ultimately what citizens of Turkey care about is their livelihood. You cannot use or build popularity on the notion that Turkey is under siege, because at the end of the day, the voters in Ankara, Istanbul, and so on and so forth will look at their finances or their life prospects, their healthcare, and so on, and make a decision based on that, not because of the threat. But it's still an important electoral resource that you could exploit, and Erdogan does it almost by instinct. So I think you're absolutely right that will be there. But equally, I don't think Turkish foreign policy is reduced to this internal use of foreign policy. There are strategic and other structural factors playing into the policy. The fact that Turkey is surrounded by instability in the Middle East, but also now the Caucasus, the rise of Russia, the kind of issues related to COVID, EU. There's a lot of feeding into decision making, not just the kind of populist impulses that Erdogan has. And equally, even if you have a different government, which is a big if, and it won't happen obviously, some of those determinants will be there anyhow.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, Mr. Bechev, I know you have a book coming out on Turkey. Could you tell us a little bit about it? What's its scope and when you hope to publish it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been trying to put together this project which looks at Turkey really since the late 80s and until present. And one theme I want to explore, and I'm exploring in the book, is continuity. Because, you know, this whole discourse about the new Turkey stresses that we have a very new situation with a new institutional setup, a strongman at the top. But in many respects, what you see, both internally but also in foreign policy, is the return to some of the worst reflexes. And for instance, think about the Eastern Mediterranean. It's really reminiscent of this type of situation we had in the 1990s with Greece and Cyprus. Authoritarianism is nothing new to Turkey. And so one of the issues is grapples how much of new Turkey is new. And second thing I'm addressing is what we just discussed a second ago. Turkish emancipation from the West. It's a bit to become this autonomous power in the region, and by region, it's not just the Middle East, obviously it's the Caucasus, but also increasingly sub-Saharan Africa. So I'm looking at how this dynamic, what are the origins of this pursuit of power and how we got where we are. So hopefully it allows for an interesting book, and I hope that people in Turkey, but also outside the country, will find it of some value.
Mm-hmm. Any potential dates for its publication?
Well, I'm finishing the first draft, and I hope to have the book out early next year. So wish me luck.
Good luck, Dimitar Bechev. Thank you so much for having joined us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. See you next Friday at 9 p.m. Good night.